I'm the storyteller, and my stories must be told. I have many stories, tales for both the young and old. I have many voices to describe many places. Many names have I, and many faces. In Russia I am Ivan, in Sweden I am Jan. In Germany I'm Johann, in America I'm John. From my many travels I have gathered these tales to teach you good sense when all else fails. Sometimes there are tears, sometimes there is laughter, but always are happily ever after.
Long ago and far away, in a great and noble palace set on a hill, there once lived a beautiful princess whose name was Astrid. Astrid was indeed a very lovely young girl, and you would think that she would have been a very happy one. After all, she lived in luxury. She had beautiful clothes and fine jewels, and because she was the only child, she only had to ask for something, and her father, the king, would give it to her. In fact, you would be forgiven for thinking that she must have been one of the happiest young girls in the kingdom. Not a bit of it. She was so sad that nothing and nobody could make her laugh. Her father was very worried about her, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find out why Astrid was so sad. If he asked her what was the matter, she would just look right through him. The king was at his wits' end as he summoned his advisers around him. What could he do with the girl? After all, it wasn't as if he was a bad father. He'd given her everything she had ever wanted. She really shouldn't have a worry in the world. Why couldn't she cheer up a bit? He asked, as he called for a glass of wine to lift his spirits while he racked his brains to find a reason for his daughter's melancholy. Maybe she needed to be entertained more, a conjurer, perhaps some puppets. The very next day, a little wooden man marched into Astrid's presence. The king and his courtiers were entranced as the puppets bowed to Astrid and then clung to their master, for all the world like two real, rather shy little people. But Astrid didn't seem to be in the slightest bit interested. In fact, she seemed to be miles away, as indeed she was. It wasn't puppets she was dreaming about. She was dreaming of far-off exotic lands, full of strange sights and strange people and fabulous palaces. Try as he might, the puppeteer couldn't even make Astrid smile. The puppets nodded and jiggled and cavorted, but all to no avail. Anyone could see that this wasn't going to change Astrid's sad face. Clearly, they were going to have to try something else. Sadly and reluctantly, the puppeteer left the palace. Maybe someone else would have better luck. The king certainly hoped so. Next to try was the conjurer. He could find coloured glass balls everywhere he looked, or so it seemed. "Oh, bravo!" cried the king and his courtiers. None of the clever man's tricks raised even the slightest smile. Astrid sat still as a statue. she was dreaming of more strange lands, where the sun always shone and the countryside was full of beauty, so unlike our own country, where the winters seemed so cold and long. Would nothing make her smile or bring her out of herself? The king was quite beside himself as he shooed everyone away. He was going to make Astrid laugh, no matter what. He was feeling slightly better by the time the clowns arrived. In fact, the old king was tickled pink by their antics. What a laugh they were as they pulled each other this way and that. But Astrid didn't even notice them. She was far away and dreaming of yet more distant countries of which she had heard tell, where the temples, the palaces, and even the markets were completely unlike anything she or anyone else in her country had ever seen. The clowns weren't of the slightest interest to her, and the king soon saw that although he might find them amusing, she certainly didn't. The king was in an absolute fury as the clowns fled from the room. There was nothing for it. The first prince who made Astrid smile could have her, and jolly good riddance too. Messages were sent to the two neighbouring kingdoms, and in no time at all, the first prince had arrived. He was a nice enough-looking boy, and he brought some fine jewels with him. So fine that the king just couldn't resist popping one into his sleeve when he thought no one was looking. But Astrid was as glum as ever. The second prince brought a huge, brightly coloured gem that twinkled as it was turned. This prince was really nice looking. At least the king thought so. But Astrid was thinking that perhaps she would rather be a peasant. They always seemed to be so carefree, always dancing, always feasting, and always making merry. Smile she wouldn't. In desperation, the king sent for 3 of his most trusted soldiers. He ordered them to go to the farthest corners of the kingdom and to promise his daughter to anyone who could make her smile. Yes, any man, duke or beggar. That should do the trick, he told his advisors. So, in every marketplace in the land, the young men gathered to hear the soldiers announce the king's earnest desire that someone should be found to make the princess laugh and to take her hand in marriage if he succeeded. But woe betide them if they didn't succeed. There was a good chance they would feel the king's anger. Many of the young men decided, nevertheless, to risk upsetting the king in order to win Astrid's hand. She was, after all, very pretty and very rich, and it shouldn't be too difficult to make her smile. But when they found out just what it was to feel the king's anger, it wasn't only Astrid who had a long face. Now it so happened that in a humble cottage close by the palace walls, there lived an old man and his 3 sons. The cries of those who had failed to make the princess smile were carried down to the cottage on the wind, and the old man thought he had best warn his 3 boys. The eldest, a soldier, was determined to try his luck, as was the second, who was a schoolmaster. But the third was a modest and happy-go-lucky lad called Merry Tom, and he had no desire to risk a beating. Well, whoever was going first had better get a move on, and as the soldier was the eldest, he got to his feet and readied himself for the fray. His father advised him that if he just used his natural talents, there was a chance he might make the princess laugh. Off he marched through the snow. He soon came to the palace gate. He saluted 2 of his comrades, then marched up to the central courtyard. The king and his daughter were waiting to see what this latest suitor would try. The soldier remembered his father's advice and decided to do what he knew best, which of course was drilling. Up and down he marched, swinging his arms and stamping his feet. Left, right, he had never drilled so smartly in his whole life. But although the king was quite impressed, the princess was bored rigid. The soldier presented arms in a final salute and awaited the king's judgment, which came all too quickly. So now it was the second son's turn. He was determined to try his luck, despite what had just happened to his brother. He was very clever and was sure that he could make the princess laugh. After all, the children in his class laughed at him all day long. He had never been to court before, but was quite sure that the courtiers spent most of their time drinking tea and chatting idly amongst themselves. If he were to imitate them, he would be sure to make the princess laugh. The king had never seen anything so funny in his entire life. He was always complaining that his courtiers never did any work, so he was most amused to see them being mocked. But Astrid wasn't half as amused as her father. In fact, she wasn't amused at all. The king was furious and dashed off to give the schoolmaster his medicine. Well, it was a very cold day, but at least one part of the schoolmaster felt pretty warm, a good deal too warm, as a matter of fact. That left Merry Tom. And of course, he had already decided that he could manage quite well without a warm seat. Besides, what could a princess possibly see in him? And anyway, he would much rather go fishing. He was far too modest and happy-go-lucky to think that he stood a chance of winning the princess. and was quite happy to fish for the fat brown trout that swam in the nearby lake. He soon hooked himself a beauty. He popped it in his pail and set off home again. He hadn't gone very far when he met a kind-looking woman with a plump goose under her arm. How would she like to exchange the goose for this fat brown trout? And he'd throw in the pail and fishing rod as well. It didn't seem a very good deal, but the woman was only too pleased. There was a problem about that goose, you see, because whoever grabbed hold of it, that was not the owner, would stick fast to it. Tom wasn't at all put out by that, and went off delighted with his bargain. A little way along the road, Tom passed a man clearing the snow from the front of his house. What a fine meal that goose would make for the man's family. How much, he wondered? Would you have to pay for it? Perhaps he should first feel how plump the bird was, advised Tom. But naturally, the minute the man did so, his hand stuck fast to it. He pulled and pushed, he twisted and turned, but in the end he had no alternative but to tag along with Tom and the goose as they made their way back home. When they came to the outskirts of the town, they passed the house of a merchant who was owed money by the man stuck fast to the goose. Now at last the merchant had him and grabbed hold of the man. He stuck fast. No matter what he did, there was nothing for it but to go along with Tom and the goose. At the marketplace, some of the merchant's friends saw the trouble he was in and rushed to help. Straight away, they were caught up in the strange procession and forced to tag along. The burly farmer thought that he could stop them and, grabbing hold, dug in his heels. His wife thought that he was going off to the inn with some of his friends, so she caught hold of him and was stuck fast herself. Neighbours of the farmer and his wife saw their predicament and ran to help. But they too were swept off. They slipped and skidded through the town, making a most terrible commotion. Tom was hooting with laughter. The goose was cackling. The people were shouting and cursing, and all the while more people grabbed hold of the procession and all were forced to tag along. The market was in an uproar, with sheep buying, stalls collapsing, chickens flapping everywhere in fright. What a terrible to-do it was! Suddenly, Tom found he was outside the palace gates. The soldiers couldn't believe their eyes, and by the time they had taken in the strange spectacle, it was too late to shut the gate on the crowd. The whole town was caught up in the chain by now. Boys catcalled, girls ran beside their parents, shouting and yelling, while everyone slipped about on the snowy slopes. Everyone was roaring, some with anger, some laughing fit to bust. soldier ran from the upper courtyard to see what all the commotion was about and dashed off to warn the palace of the invasion by this bawling human centipede. The king was having a quiet doze as the courtiers ran to see what was going on. But he was soon awakened. He too hurried off to see for himself what this circus was that had disturbed his palace. His daughter, the princess, had run to the window before him. What she saw made her hastily cover her mouth to hide a grin. At long last, the princess burst out laughing. The spell was broken, and everyone tumbled to the ground. They jumped up again and danced for joy. The princess had at last cast off her sadness, while the king wept buckets in happiness and gratitude at this miracle. Now, of course, the king had promised that whoever made the princess laugh would have her hand in marriage, whether he were a prince, a duke, or a beggar. As the cause of all this merriment had been Merry Tom, there was nothing for it but to arrange the wedding at once. The king wasn't at all sure how he felt about having Tom for a son-in-law, but at least he could be thankful that at last his daughter was happy. Tom's father and brothers were delighted. Nobody noticed the goose lady at the back of the church, who smiled to herself as Tom and Astrid were pronounced man and wife.